Hi everybody! So this is Deaf Education Through the Years, and we're going to talk a little bit about how it came to be, what happened in these 205 years, how it came to be, how it's changed, how far we've come, and some things might even surprise you a little bit. So just to start off with a fun fact, did you know that America was discovered 245 years ago, but deaf education is only 205 years old? And so if you do a little bit of quick math, you find that for 40 years in America, deaf education did not exist. And when we think about a lot of the things that we've learned in Intro to the Deaf community and throughout the semester, that deaf people, they were just not served, I feel, to the ability that they deserve to be served. And time again, we're heartbroken by things that have happened or decisions that were made for the deaf community. And so it's frustrating straight off the bat that they were underserved for 40 years. But we're going to learn how they received their education. And that starts with how it came to be. And so two people that we've talked a lot about in class are Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet and Louis Laurent Marie Claire. And these two guys met in Europe, and around the same time they also met a gentleman named Cogswell. His last name was Cogswell, and he was the parent of his daughter was deaf, and she lived in North America. Now, America was discovered in 1776, and they met many years before, and then they decided that they were going to travel to North America, they were going to meet his daughter, and they were going to establish a deaf school, because they actually had already established a deaf school, but it was in France. And that's why we find in sign language that a lot of our signs are actually French signs, not even air quotes, and they are French signs. And so that's kind of how sign language came to be, right? So these two have established a deaf school, and they decide, okay, let's go to North America. And so it's 1816, so you can't just hop on a plane, you have to take a boat. And so they travel across the Atlantic Ocean by boat on June 18th, 1816. And they arrived in Hartford, Connecticut on August 22nd, 1816. So 50 or so days it took them. And they meet Alice there. And Alice is the daughter of the father, and Gallaudet and Claire and Alice all work together through different communication. They described it as sign language in my research and things like that. I'm not sure exactly what it was. I'm not sure if it was gestures or what they were in what ways they were interacting, because Claire was deaf, Gallaudet was hearing, and Alice was deaf. And so we have a very interesting mixture here. But they've opened a deaf school before, so they thought, we can do this. And so after just a couple of months of working with Alice, they open the Connecticut Asylum at Hartford for the instruction of deaf and dumb persons. And as we know, deaf and dumb persons is not how we refer to the deaf community now. We call them deaf or hard of hearing. And so aside from, this progression of the deaf education through the years with this presentation about, it's also really interesting to talk about the fact how language has changed. So on April 15th, 1817, they opened this school. Gallaudet's the principal, Claire is the head teacher, and they only have 7 students. But the very first one enrolled was, you guessed it, Alice Cogswell. And so she enrolls with 6 other students, and in time, the school becomes the American School for the Deaf, which I believe is what it's known as today. But this was this long-winded name in Connecticut when it all started. So now, to kind of understand what's happened over the last 205 years, we're going to go on a journey in segments of 5 over 40 years at a time. And so 40 years is like a big chunk of time, but I thought, what's the best way to take 205 years and break it down, because we only have so much time, right? And so we're just going to go section by section and talk about what happened. So the next year, they have more students come in. And these students range from 10 to 51 years of age, which is a really interesting thing to find. But if you think about it, these people were underserved for so long. And so it wasn't just school-age children or college students or people who were looking for education. It was people across the board of all different kinds of ages. So they all attended what became the American School for the Deaf, a residential school where they taught sign language. And Claire taught there for many, many years, obviously a very long time, and, well, let me see, 40 years, and then he retired. So now fast forward 40 more years, and the first 40 years were focused on residential schools and sign language. So what changes 40 years later? Well, in 1864, Gallaudet University is founded by Gallaudet's son. Claire passes away in 1869 at 83 years old. And oralism takes center stage with Alexander Graham Bell, which we've talked a little bit about in class. So Alexander Graham Bell, he did not believe in speech. Although his wife and his mother were deaf, he really didn't, he did believe in speech. He didn't believe in sign language. And so he was very against sign language. And so he thought deaf people had to learn how to speak. And so he taught at Horace Mann, which was a deaf school during his time. Before and during his time as a Boston University professor in the 1870s. And in 1872, he founded an oralist school. So we have Gallaudet and Claire, or whomever replaces Gallaudet and Claire because they have passed, running this school, this university, this residential school where people are learning sign language and having a place to be educated. And then we have this other group, Bell, in the school teaching oralism. And so what happens? Well, in 1880, sign language is actually banned. And so you have this group of people who only use sign language. What are they going to do? Well, years later, the National Association of the Deaf is founded, and they defended the ability of the American deaf community to use sign language and organize around important issues. So now what happens? In the next 40 years, this is really where manualism and oralism conflict or fight one another, if you will. Tensions were high. Gallaudet, Bell. Gallaudet's for manualism, Bell's for oralism. And so this was a real struggle and a real concern. And one of the articles that I found actually was this quote: "It was rare to see an educator who was deaf teaching deaf students and people using sign language," which I think is really interesting and kind of parlays into what happens in the next 40 years. But what's important here to know is that manualism and oralism were two options, but they were never existing cohesively. So now we step 40 more years into the future. From 1937 to 1977 is where a lot of our technology comes out. The TTY and VRS, and William Stokey actually finishes the ASL dictionary. And actually what you find that I didn't put a whole lot in here is that there's a lot of governmental things going on for the deaf community, legislature, and different things that people are fighting for. So it was a very big time for government and conventions and things of that nature. So that's really interesting. So finally, in the last section of this 40 years, 1977 to 2017, or into today, 2022, a lot of things happen. So a guy by the name of Robert J. Hoffmeister comes to Boston University in the 1970s, and he argued that teaching methods that shunted aside ASL were based on a myth that learning sign language would prevent deaf children from excelling in English. But he also said society has been conditioned to view deafness as a negative, a condition in need of fixing. And so he is coming in passionate about sign language, right? And understanding that deaf people are not broken, right? They simply just can't hear. But what's interesting about all of this is that up until 1975, so remember we talked about this as a 205-year span, and 1975 is kind of like the last 40 years. So essentially for the last 40 or so years, deaf students were only educated at residential schools and day schools, so Gallaudet University and other residential schools. But we've come a long way from that because of, I think, the Deaf President Now movement, in which a bunch of deaf students gathered in 1988 and asked for a deaf president because they said, we want someone who looks like us, we want someone who relates. So they asked for that. And also the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990, which allowed students the resources to be in mainstream mainstream schools, public education, where they can learn with hearing children and interact with hearing children and learn sign language. And so we've come a long way from manualism versus oralism because now they're living cohesively. Now, this was really cool, really interesting, something that I learned in my research. Remember back to Alexander Graham Bell working at Horace Mann, and he was very, very passionate about oralism. So Boston's Horace Mann School for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, and I'm not certain this is the exact same school, so that's where I get lost a little bit, but this is cool. So in November of 2019, they celebrated their 150th anniversary, and they became the only dual language school to teach both American Sign Language and English. And I think that's really beautiful from where we've come with Graham Bell being like, no oralism only, no sign language. And now this establishment is a dual language school where they have curriculum where they teach both cohesively together. And I think that's just really beautiful. So in summation, what happened in 205 years? Well, a deaf education was established. It was started at the Connecticut Asylum at Hartford for the instruction of deaf and dumb persons. All of these people came out, and Claire and Gallaudet worked together with one another simply until they died, and then oralism took the stage. And so we have Gallaudet University teaching manualism, we have oralism at another school. Then Gallaudet and Bell were at odds with each other. Someone has to be right. There has to be, someone who wins. Then we have the invention of all of this different technology and how that came to be and how that allowed us to become what we've become. And then now, even stretching in today, deaf students have options, they have opportunities, they have legislation, they have experience, they have all of these things that is just really grown from what we were. And now we have a school that's a dual language school, which is just mind-blowing that there's a school in America that teaches both sign language and English in their curriculum when it was frowned upon for so long. And so deaf education has really progressed. It's really come a long way. And I think it's important that we recognize that. So yeah, thanks for watching my presentation. I hope you have a great day.